All right. And this is the first time I've given this. It's obviously a technical type of talk valuing your early stage biotech company. And so I'm really going to encourage anyone that has questions, especially clarifying questions, to put them in the chat as we go along, rather than trying to save them for the very end. So this is brought to you obviously by University Lab Partners, and thank you, as well as the Beall Applied Innovation Small Business Development Center. All right, and Julie told you about us, and here's me, and we will get going. So what I'd like to do today is tell you a bit about valuing your startup company, especially your biotech startup company. And we'll start with how not to value your biotech company. So this talk probably grew out of a little bit of frustration that I've had as entrepreneurs pitch their companies, and they'll put up a valuation slide, and the first question an investor will say is, how'd you get that? And there will be blank stares from the entrepreneurs. So I'm going to try to help you have a good answer to that question. And we'll do that by understanding first how mature companies set their valuations, and then why those methods are hard to use for startups. We'll provide several alternative methods that are used for valuing startup companies, and then appreciate the very unique challenges that exist for biotech startup companies, right? So the caveats to this are that this topic can get wildly complicated. And if you have friends who like math, this is a great place for them to dive in and get lost. We are not going to go there today, not even close. There's a really important concept that if you do not understand it, I encourage you to learn more about it, and that is the time value of money, how money today should be worth more in the future. It's a really important concept, and we'll be using that at the end of the talk today. So most of the talk will not require that. Other methods are used for valuing startup companies. All right, so I'd like to initiate a poll just before we get started. And so Emily, if you could launch the poll, just 3 questions, real simple. If you could each answer those and submit, and we'll wait just a few minutes for you to do that. How knowledgeable do you feel about valuing a startup company? And then, have you created an investor pitch deck? And does your pitch deck include your company valuation? And Emily, how are we doing?
So for the first question, most people responded somewhat knowledgeable. Okay. And then the second one is a little knowledgeable.
Okay. Right. And so the second question, let's just run through these real quickly. Have you created an investor pitch deck is the second question. And I don't see it. Here we go.
Here you go.
And then, does your pitch deck include your company valuation? Will be the third one.
All right. Do you want me to move on to the third question?
Yes. Okay. Go on to the third one. It's just yes and no's. Please answer. We're just looking for where we are in this. All right. Do you have a reasonable number of answers?
All right. Let me go ahead and share this.
Okay, and let's just close down the poll and I'll get started. All right. Oops. All right, so here's how not to value your biotech company. So saying things like, how'd you get that number? Your 5 million valuation, well, we've had 5 million in NIH grants, and that's just not relevant. You needed a good number. Basically, I don't know how I got it. I needed a good number. Or something I've heard a lot, basically saying, putting it back, it's a negotiation. The investors will tell me. Both of those leave you in a weak position, and I encourage you not to use that, and instead to really think through what you believe your company should be valued. So this is how mature companies set valuations. There are public companies, and those are publicly traded, so there's a known share price, there's a known number of shares. Multiplying the share price by the number of shares gives the market value, market capitalization. That's for public companies. There are other companies that are private. They may be quite large, but they're profitable and mature. And those companies, when they get bought and sold, will actually collect comparable companies. They'll look at public companies and their financials, and they'll compare their financials with public companies to set their private company valuation. And then there are private companies that are not yet profitable, and most of the startups fall into this category, where you have to use projections and comparables rather than your current financials. So that's what we're going to go through. So just to remind you, public company valuation, you can all find this here for Pfizer and Becton Dickinson, a pharmaceutical company and a diagnostics medical device company. You can see that there are a number of things: the opening share price, you can find all sorts of things, the revenue, the sales revenue growth. And then there are these ratios, the price or value to earnings or profit ratio, the value, the price to sales or revenue, and the price to the book value. So those ratios, collecting those ratios can give you information to compare when you're with a private company that doesn't have these public financials. So that's exactly what you might do if you have a private but profitable, reasonably mature type of company. You'd find several comparable public companies and identify key ratios like the price or value of the company to the sales or revenue, the price, the value to the earnings or profit. And then you use your financial statements, so the private company financial statements, to estimate the value based on the similar ratios of comparable companies. And this is reasonable for mature companies, even though they're private, that have stable growth. It's still an art. If you use different ratios, you'll get slightly different numbers. And so there is art, there is negotiation, but it's supported by the facts. Here, just looking, four pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Amgen, Gilead, and Novartis. Two that I would consider quite mature, Pfizer and Novartis, with Amgen and Gilead. And as you look at the ratios, you can see some really large differences in the price to earnings, the value to the profit, with Gilead having a really high valuation to its comparable profit. And what this is indicating is that there's expected growth in the future. All right, so similarly, there are differences in different ratios. What you can do is decide that Gilead is or is not more comparable to you and just use that and their ratios. You can average things if you think some of the companies are more similar to yours, or you can use the high and the low to give you a range of potential valuations as a start. Okay, so here's just an example for Amgen, the ratios, price to earnings, and if any of you are CFOs or have CFOs, this isn't exactly right, but roughly the P to E ratio is roughly the market cap, right, the value, to the earnings or annual profit, right? So it's roughly P to E, 146 divided by 7 gives you roughly 20. Here, the price to sales, value, the market cap divided by the revenue, right? And so this is roughly how you can estimate your own value based on your own projections. Oops. All right, so why do these methods not work very well for startups? Startups aren't public, so you can't look up the price of the share price. Startups often will have no revenue or earnings, so multiples of your current revenue don't really matter. And even if you do have current revenue, you expect big growth, and so the current revenue or current earnings will tend to undervalue the company. So what do you do instead? Well, there are a number of different methods, and they're very different from one another. There are scorecard methods, and we'll talk about two of those, one by Dave Burkus and another modified by Bill Payne, two angel investors in Southern California that had big influence in the angel community. There are comparables and investor rules of thumb that you can use to help you value your company. You certainly can use comparables and multiples like P to E and P to S with your projected revenue and earnings. You can also use M&A transactions and then discount the value to today's valuation. All right, so scorecard method basically says, I know that 2.5 million valuation is like the highest I'm going to be considering. And you set a set of criteria here. Dave Burkus had 5 criteria, each of which is equally rated, and he's giving a score for each company that he's looking at and evaluating whether to make an investment or not, of 0 to 500K. And basically at the end, he'll add up these numbers and get a company valuation. All right, so this method is good because it provides a structure. It reminds the investor of what they really care about, here the management team, whether the idea just makes sense, whether there's a prototype and technology risk has been reduced. Strategic relationships, meaning relationships with existing companies in the market to reduce the market risk. And any existing sales reduces production or manufacturing risk. So you've actually made something and sold it. So scoring 0 to 500 on those provides a maximum value if you get 500 on all 5 of them of 2.5 million. This was created in the 1990s, and certainly the average valuations have probably gone up a bit since then. But nonetheless, I'd say the maximum seed round that I tend to see that investors will even consider will be in the $4 million range. Okay, so this is one scorecard method. And Bill Payne developed a slightly different scorecard method. Again, really very similar types of categories: the team, the size of the opportunity, does it make sense? The product, right? Is it disruptive? The sales channels, are they existing? The stage of the business. And there are ratings, a score, right? But then there are weights. So Payne provided the opportunity to say, I think the management team is the most important thing out of everything. So I'm going to weight the score for the management team. All right. Again, it has, all of these have a very arbitrary starting point, like 2.25 million, and then you would multiply your score by that maximum. All right, I'm going to check the chat. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we have one question.
Okay.
GJ is asking, if you have a biotech product, but one it made locally, does Molly and a team advise as to which companies in the Inland Empire or would be able to make a product?
That's where we can do our best to use our network and encourage you to use your network to figure out how to do that. So I would say yes, it depends, but we'll do our best to reach out to our network and encourage you to do the same. All right, let's keep going with valuation. There are some general investor rules of thumb that I want to communicate to everyone. Early stage equity investors, whether they're angels or venture capital investors, really are looking for a 10 to 20x return on investment in 3 to 5 years, right? That's a lot. There will be a rationale for why. They typically don't want to take more than about a third ownership. And so that sets some bounds on what your valuation should be. Not too much, not too little. That's the equity investor. Not too much because they want to leave the founders incentivized, right? Smart equity investors also don't want to overvalue a company because they know from experience that down rounds are very bad for everyone. They expect that of 10 early stage investments, 4 or 5 are going to be a complete bust. The company will return nothing. That another almost half of them will have a 1x return, which actually is a loss. And the hope is that 1 out of those 10 is a real wow with 10-fold or more return. And so your plan, in order to attract the interest of the investors, your plan has to be for a wow, right? So that's where your financials should be pointing the investors. Right, so there's a method that I do encourage you to consider called the venture capital method. It uses industry multiples here, like the price to earnings, which in this table is 15x, which is something that you've looked up or calculated based on who you think comparable public companies are. You're looking for a $1 million investment, and your plan is that there will be an exit in year 5. That is, you'll be acquired, you'll go public, something will happen, that there's a real liquidity event, year 5. You have financial projections, and in that exit year, you're projecting to have $20 million in revenue with, again, from your financials, a 10% net profit or a $2 million profit in year 5 at the exit. All right, that gives you enough information. Those projections give you enough information to value the company at year 5. And that's the $2 million profit times the 15x multiple to give a $30 million company value at year 5 at the exit. All right. Now going back, the investors here, you're assuming, because you're doing this calculation, the investors need a 10x return on investment. They're putting in 1 million, and so they need 10 million out at the exit point, right? What that means, since there's a $30 million exit value and the investors need 10 million, that the investors actually need a third of the company. And what that leads to with the $1 million investment is a $2 million pre-money, $3 million post-money, giving the investors a 33% share. All right. So that used multiples to do that. So again, steps in the VC valuation method: find an industry multiple. You may use an average or calculate some kind of high-low, so there may be a range like 15 to 30. You might also consider using, instead of price, to earnings, earnings being profit, where profit is the revenue minus cost of goods. You could use just the value to the revenue as an additional estimate. You've got financial projections at the exit date. You've got assumptions on when you will exit, and it is best in your calculations to pick 3 to 5 years, because that's what the investors want to hear, and they have an expectation. So then you calculate your value at exit, the investor expectation at exit, the share that means at exit, and then the pre and post money at the investment point. And this breaks down, this method is great, but it does break down when there are multiple rounds that create dilution for these early investors. It also breaks down because for most biotechs, at 3 to 5 years, you still don't have revenue or profit, or those numbers are changing dramatically because you should be growing, right? So the special challenges for biotech companies are you get huge failure rates that create real winners and losers with little in between. So there's a risk adjustment that investors want to put into this. They're really long timelines, which is terrible for investors because they're always looking at, oh my gosh, do I really have to wait 12 to 15 years to get my money back? And they're not going to want that. There are high cash needs for most biotech companies, 500 million for a drug, 60 million for a class 3 medical device. And what that means, every investor, early stage investor, knows they're likely to be diluted because you're absolutely going to need additional capital. All right, so how do you overcome those challenges of biotech companies? And one of the ways that I've seen that's reasonably successful is to remind investors of the merger and acquisition appetite of the biotech industry. Both pharma and medical devices, device companies tend to be active in acquiring new products prior to the point they're actually on the market. So those M&A activities actually de-risk the investment quite a bit. And so you're using the M&A of comparable companies to value where you will be in the future, right? So if you say this company got acquired for $100 million and it's going to, in 3 years, we could be there, right? That's really similar to our situation. So use the M&A values of comparable companies to value where you will be in the future. You estimate based on your project timelines how far in the future that M&A event will be. And then you use the time value of money to estimate the present value, right? Now, this method actually has the advantage of actually being reasonable, close approximation to reality. It also helps to document to investors that the long timelines for you to get to be a profitable company selling products is not the necessarily most likely outcome of this investment. Reminding them of M&A is an important tool that you have as an entrepreneur. So with that, yes, the slides will be made available and they will be, I believe, on the SBDC website. We'll get them there. Do your homework. That's my, don't be caught deer in the headlights. How did you get that particular valuation? Use multiple methods for estimating your company value and be ready to talk about those. How did you get to a $4 million valuation? Well, we use comparable companies and M&A, and you go through the whole rationale. You do, as you're doing this, especially as you use multiple methods, which I encourage, use the sniff test in the sense that if different methods give you wildly different results, you need to keep thinking. Are you more like the high one? Can you justify that? Or are you more like the lower or average valuation? Don't just pick the highest. Having a high valuation early on is not in your best interest. In the long run, the fair value will be best. And don't ever forget, a small portion of a big pie is way better than a big portion of a small pie. And down rounds, as I have personal experience, can be worse than painful. They can actually kill a company. All right, so I believe that's where I'm going to end and start some Q&A. We've got contact information here. You can become an SBDC client and go to sbdctech.org, and there's a place to sign up to be a new client. Any suggestions for future webinars, send them to me, molly.schmid@ociesbdc.com. And we'll have a final exit poll before we get to Q&A. So Emily, if you could launch these two questions. And if you could quickly add those in and submit the answers. And Emily, as soon as you get what seems to be enough answers, let's stop and we can let some questions come in.
Perfect. Do you see the results?
Sure. Awesome. Okay. So let's close the poll and let's see, I've got a dog barking in the background. I don't know if people can hear that. And what am I going to do? Stop the share. We done with the poll, right? Oh my goodness. The mailman's here, guys. Emily, can you, are you going to field questions?
Yes, do you want me to read them to you?
Sure.
All right, so we have one question asking, how much equity should be given for how much investment?
Okay, and this is where you need to start watching Shark Tank, right? So the amount of the investment and how much equity are proportional, they're percentages. So the basic equation is that there is a pre-investment or pre-money valuation of a company. And let's say that pre-money valuation is $2 million. Let's say that you are seeking $1 million. And the basic equation is that the pre-money plus the investment is equal to the post-money. So 2 million pre-money plus 1 million investment will give 3 million post-money. What that creates is that the statement of how much equity, right? Because the investors now own 1 out of 3 million of the value of the company, or 33% of the company, and that will be reflected in the number of shares that are granted. It will be 1/3 of the total number of shares in the company. All right, next question.
Okay, next question is, how much you value a startup with platform technology, whereas multiple new products will be created from single new technology?
Yes, and that is a situation that arises reasonably frequently. And you know, as I said, there's some data that you want to have, but this is an art, and what you want to do is do your best. So comparables are a funny thing. Nobody's really comparable. If you're buying houses, this house is not really comparable to that. But we all know that for houses, you do that. It's pretty comparable. It's in the same neighborhood. It's the same size. You use something to provide equivalence. And so that's the best answer that I can do. You just have to look at what your platform technology is and say, okay, is it like a new diagnostic technology? If it is, then gosh, what if I was like Becton Dickinson, right? And what are they valued at? And maybe there are some, BD is a pretty mature company, so maybe you want to go for a younger company that's still public and see where they are. But you just worm your way down. You should be looking at competitor companies anyways. And that list of competitors often will provide you with good comparables. All right, what else?
Looks like there's no more questions in the chat. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to hop on video, ask the questions, or write them in the chat, and I'll be happy to speak them. Oh, I think we have somebody.
Okay.
Hi. Very informative, I must say, and
Great.
very useful seminar. Thank you. I have a question because I'm not really in the biotech, but the product that I'm building could be useful for a health hazard kind of risk mapping and things like that. And so I also have this question about the platform technology, because the product that we are building is like, it can be used by the healthcare industry as well as all other kinds of industry. We are doing climate prediction tool, and across the big data, which can be used as a plug and play across wildly different kinds of industry. So in that case, how do we actually value the company? So my basic question is, who decides how much? I mean, you said like the pre-money valuation plus the investment that we see, and the equity comes as a ratio of that. But we may not be asking for the full scale that we need to develop the company. We may be asking for only part of it, which is what we are currently doing. And in that case, how do we decide? Like, for example, we were trying to raise 750K with 10% of the company. And as a Bay Area company, when we talk to mentors, they seem to say, yeah, that's fine. It's a software kind of platform. So how is that different between what you say and what we have been told so far?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. First of all, what I'm encouraging you to do mostly is not just make it up, right?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So when you say, and we're gonna, get 10% of the company, whatever it was, 7.5 million. The investor should ask you why, right?
Correct.
And if your answer is because I only want to give away 10% of the company, that's not a financial based argument. Okay. Now, when you have multiple platform technology that you could use here, you could use there, I'd encourage you to step back and just say, okay, what are the 3 or 4, however many different big areas that technology could be applied? What's the first place you're going to go, right? First to market.
Right.
But then step back and say, is that like 25% of the total? Is it 10% of the total, right? And just value based on, if you decide it's 10% of the total value, that's what it is. But also be thinking that this platform technology, although it's housed in a single company right now, might actually launch spin-offs.
Exactly.
And so I would say compartmentalize things. So current company, but this project, if an investor is investing in this particular project, value that. Tell them what they're buying, right? The whole company might be worth more, but is this project, we think that's 10%. There are a lot of things to negotiate about that, but having a starting point and having thought through the problem will put you both in a better position to negotiate with people who are used to seeing these things, right? As well as be more impressive to the investor that you actually are trying to know what you're doing. Right?
Mhm.
That's the point I want to get you, so that you're sounding like knowledgeable entrepreneurs as opposed to folks that are making it up for the very first time.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Let's see. Any other questions, Emily?
Nothing in the chat, but we have one question from Chad,
Okay.
long one. How do you plan for multiple rounds of investing? So as an example, assuming you have a target that gets the 10 times ROI for the VC for 33% equity, but the whole business model requires 10 mil to complete, do you recommend all 10 mil in round one or break it into steps and plan on valuations increasing with each round?
Yeah, you almost have to break it into steps unless you're talking, if you are a pharmaceutical startup and you've got the kind of pull to attract high caliber venture capital money right out of the box, then maybe you can think about a $10 million Series A, because you're going to need a $50 million Series B. But if you're talking, a more typical type of startup that needs 500K or $1 million or maybe 2 million to provide some type of proof of principle, even though you recognize you're going to need more money down the road. The basic, again, rule of thumb is to ask for about 18 months worth of capital. What do you need in the next 18 months? And then ask for that and break things down roughly on an 18-month to 2-year kind of timeline. That's the best and most expected way to do your financings. Right? Yes, so break it into steps and plan on valuations increasing. So the question was about dilutions. And I encourage you to do what investors will do. So if you tell an investor, we're looking for 1 million today, but we're going to need 10 million over the next 3 or 4 years, the investor will sort of get out Excel and they'll run the numbers and see if it makes sense for them to make this investment. So I encourage you to do that, right? And to understand what the investors are doing themselves so that you know how to answer their questions and so that you can somehow assure them that your plan is to meet their investment expectations.